Well, the sun's out, so again I thought it'd be nice to do a video now on some of the best settings for the Canon 600D in respect of video settings anyway.
You can see the very first option you might want to change is movie exposure. We've had a tutorial on movie exposure before. If you want day-to-day stuff for shooting the family or just ease of use, like I am now doing this particular video, and you've got changing weather conditions as we actually have here, I generally send that to auto. But if you want to do something slightly more ambitious, kind of more like professional looking, or do some more ambitious effects, etc., then you want to be setting that to manual. AF mode, we had a previous look at in a tutorial on that. I would normally leave that to live mode. Highlight tone priority, I just disable that. I don't bother to set that. If we go along to movie recording size, that's one of the other main things you've got to choose, and you can see there I've set that to 1920 by 1080, 24 frames per second. If I click on the set button there, and that's the one really people try to use to emulate Hollywood cinematography. It's got the 24 frames per second, which is the frame rate used in mainstream cinema, and it's also got the 1920 by 1080 HD quality. That's full HD. Side, you can see sound recording there. Well, generally I would set that to auto. There is another video which I've done showing where you would use the manual setting, but generally I set that to auto. I've set the metering timer. That's actually for the holding the exposure. You've probably seen that in one of the I think it's in the auto exposure lesson I did, and that's by default that's set to 4 seconds. If you're going to be using that in auto exposure, then I find personally 30 seconds is a much more useful time, which I set it to that. Other things, well, here's a grid display. That's actually quite useful, and that's useful for setting up your shot overall, how your shot looks composition wise, and I stick it to grid 1. And the reason I do that, if you have a look at the screen there, you see the grid appears, and the idea is this kind of rule of thirds thing, that you get main it's perhaps not very well shot up on this, but I'll stand in the scene now and you might see it, that the main characters or points of interest are at the intersecting points. So I'm roughly at one of the intersecting points there, I think, on the grid, which anyway I may not be the most interesting subject to be watching, but generally when you're filming, the idea is for composition, if you can try and get your points of interest in those intersecting areas, that's apparently the most pleasing composition for the human eye. Into the display again, video snapshot, that's nothing really to do with taking videos as you would be now. That's if you're actually doing something slightly different, which is what's called Canon has introduced a slight snapshot mode, which you can take a number of shots for a few seconds. It's normally meant for fun use, which is quite useful, and you can then edit them together. I generally just leave that to disable, but obviously it's something you might want to look at yourself. Auto lighting optimizer, I just leave that basically on standard. Custom white balance, we had another look at another tutorial at that. You don't need to do anything with that. Okay, we're going to look in picture styles, because that does affect how your video looks quite considerably. So picture style, I've got this set to standard, and I normally leave it at that. You've also got auto, which is not a bad one, and depending on your scene, portrait, landscape, you can actually affect the look a little bit, either add more colours or more contrast, etc. So standard's okay for most circumstances. If you want to edit your film afterwards and add your own colouring, you know, saturation of colours, contrast, etc., you can choose a neutral or faithful one, which gives a more washed out kind of look when you film. So you can add your own, as I said, colour saturation, contrast, colour and tone afterwards, and sharpness as well. If you go down, you can actually even set your own defined settings for a style. So once you're down, say, to user defined 1, I've set some settings there for editing afterwards, and once you're in there, if you say click on info and you come into the option, all the options within that style, and I've set on this one, for example, sharpness right down to 0. I go in there, you can see you can move it up and down. I put it down to 0. Contrast, I've put it right down minus as far as it will go. So by default it's at 0. I've put it further down. Saturation, again I've reduced that slightly from the default setting, which is 0, -2, and colour tone I've left that. Those settings are the ones that are recommended if you're going to be editing your films afterwards and want to be dealing with your own additions in your editor for sharpness, contrast, saturation, etc. Regarding quality, you can just leave that whatever setting it's on, because it doesn't affect video at all. It just affects the resolution of your photography. Useful one there in settings, you can see, is I put auto power off, i.e. if it's not been used for a while, you can set it to switch itself off after 30 seconds. I think it's 30 seconds by default. I mean, it obviously saves your batteries if you're not using it on and off, but personally I just find it aggravating if you're filming that every so often it just switches off. So I kind of disable auto power and don't have it switched on, so the camera doesn't switch off. I'm filming, by the way, I put the LCD brightness up to a maximum there, just so it's easier to see against daylight. So that's something you might bear in mind. If you're filming and you've got bright sunlight, it might be handy to set that higher, but obviously you're going to disadvantage is you're probably going to wear the battery out quicker.
Thanks very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed that.